That boy just threw away a month's wages on a pile of rust. Garrett Fenn's voice carried across the whole of the Dunmore estate sale like he wanted it to, which was to say like a man who has never once in his life said a thing quietly when an audience was available. The crowd in the old auction barn laughed the way crowds do when someone else is the joke, easy and a little too loud, and Elliot Ash did not look up from the piano. It was an ugly thing, and there was no arguing that. The lid had warped away from its hinges on one side, and the veneer had bubbled off the case in long strips the way skin peels after a burn, which in a way was what had happened. The Dunmore farmhouse had gone through a fire 18 months back, and most of what had been inside it had gone with it. The piano had survived the way heavy old things sometimes survive, through sheer stubbornness, though surviving and coming through intact were two different propositions. And no one looking at this instrument would have confused the two. 3 of the ivory keys were missing entirely. The ones that remained had gone the color of old teeth. And the auctioneer, a cheerful man named Stu Bellamy, who ran sales out of a barn on the county road between Dunmore and Lacombe, had started the bidding at $40 in the tone of a man who expects to give something away. Nobody had moved. Then Elliot Ash raised his hand and the room found something to look at. He was 22 that spring, the kind of young that still surprises people when they see it doing serious things. He had driven out from Edmonton that morning in a truck that was older than he was, and he had been standing near the back of the barn for the better part of an hour, working his way toward this piano, the way you work toward something you are trying not to appear too interested in. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face gave nothing away, which was a skill he had developed early and kept sharp. He was the only black man in the room, which in a barn outside Lacombe, Alberta, was not a thing he was surprised by, though it was a thing he was always aware of, the particular low-grade attention of a room that has already made up its mind about what a person is likely to want and what they are likely to be able to afford. 40, Bellamy said, pointing at Elliot with his gavel, and then Garrett Fenn, who had spent the last 40 minutes buying a table saw and a chest freezer and an antique rifle that he would never fire, turned around and looked at the young man in the back of the room, and a slow kind of amusement settled over his face. Garrett Fenn was the kind of man Lacombe County knew well, and the kind it had stopped being surprised by. He ran a property management company out of an office on Main Street and drove a diesel truck that he idled in front of the post office for longer than necessary because the sound of it pleased him. He was not a man who wanted a broken piano. He was not a man who played piano or who had ever wanted to. But he was very much a man who understood the sport of watching someone spend money they couldn't spare on something that wasn't worth it, and he had a gift for recognizing that situation the moment it appeared. 50, Fenn said. The room stirred. Elliot had $230 in his account. He had driven 2 hours to be here. He had a particular reason for wanting this particular piano that had nothing to do with its condition and everything to do with who had owned it, and he was not going to explain that reason to anyone in this barn, which meant he was going to have to want it in front of all of them without saying why. 60, he said. His voice came out even. He was glad of that. 70. Fenn had turned back to his neighbor now, performing indifference, which was its own kind of attention. The crowd was following the thing the way a crowd follows anything that has a clear winner and a clear loser, and everyone in the room had already decided which role belonged to the young man with his hand up. 80. 90. You know, Fenn announced to the room at large, his thumbs hooking into his belt, I've bought a lot of things at auction in this county. Never once paid good money for firewood. He gestured at the piano with the casual authority of a man pointing out the obvious. That's what that is. Firewood with keys on it. He grinned at the men beside him, and the men obliged him. 100, Elliot said. The number landed in the room, and Fenn looked at him then, really looked, the way he had not quite bothered to before, and something shifted in his expression. Not respect. Something more like the recalibration a man does when the game becomes less predictable than he anticipated. 120, Fenn said. His voice had lost its lightness. 140. The barn had gone the particular quiet of people who have stopped talking to watch. Bellamy was looking back and forth between them, with the practiced expression of a man who has seen this particular play before and knows his only job is to keep the numbers moving. 160, 180. Elliot was doing the math that the room was also doing, which was that he was running out of runway fast, and Garrett Fenn had a diesel truck and a property management company and could go another $600 without feeling it. 200, Elliot said. It was not quite all he had. It was close enough that the distinction was academic. Fenn let the silence stretch. He looked at Elliot the way a man looks at something small he is deciding whether to bother with, and then he spread his hands and laughed. All right. He waved the whole thing off like a man dispersing smoke. All right, son, you want the thing that badly. Go ahead. He turned back to the room. I'm not going to take the boys' grocery money over a heap of burnt wood. His voice was easy and generous and landed on Elliot like something wet. Going once, Bellamy said, and there was a smile in it. Going twice. Sold to the young man for $200. Elliot walked to the front and counted it out. He did not look at Garrett Fenn. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at the piano, and when the counting was done, he put his hand flat on the warped lid for a moment, just briefly, and then he went to bring his truck around. Nobody helped him load it. He hadn't expected anyone to. It took him the better part of 40 minutes, and a furniture dolly he borrowed without asking from the corner of the barn. And through all of it, the room found other things to bid on. Except for Garrett Fenn, who watched from across the barn with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, and an expression on his face that was harder to read than it had been an hour ago. What the room did not know was that the piano had belonged to Elliot's grandmother. Her name had been Cecile Ashe, and she had come to Alberta from Nova Scotia in 1971, with a husband who didn't last and a stubbornness that did. And she had played the piano in the Dunmore United Church for 26 years before her hands had made that impossible. The Dunmore farm had belonged to the family she'd worked for, the Caldwells, who had no children and who had loved her the way people love someone who has given their home a sound it didn't have before. When Eleanor Caldwell died 4 years ago, she had left the farm and everything on it to a niece in Calgary, who had no idea what any of it was worth or what any of it meant. And the niece had held an estate sale because that was the practical thing to do. Elliot's grandmother had died the winter before. She had gone quietly in the night the way the best people sometimes do, leaving the people who loved her with the particular bewilderment of a grief that arrived without any warning scene. She had left him almost nothing in material terms because she had almost nothing to leave. What she had given him was time and patience and the particular gift of her hands, which she had pressed onto his when he was 6 years old and sat him down at this same piano in the Caldwell house while Eleanor Caldwell brought them tea. And she had said, "Elliot, you're going to hear the music before you play it. Just listen first." He had been trying to do that ever since. He had a degree in audio engineering from MacEwan University that he was 6 months into using and 12 months into paying for. He worked out of a studio space he shared with 3 other people in a warehouse district in Edmonton, and he spent his days coaxing sound out of broken and mismatched equipment because broken and mismatched was what he could afford. And he had learned over those months that broken things still made sound, sometimes better sound. The imperfections were the character. He drove back to Edmonton with the piano roped down in the truck bed and his mind going over the thing he had not let himself examine too closely yet. He knew the piano was damaged. He knew it possibly could not be restored to anything resembling its original function. He knew that $200 was money he did not comfortably have. What he also knew, and this was the thing he had not said out loud to anyone, was that his grandmother had left something inside it. She had told him so. Not directly, because she had not been the kind of woman who said direct things when an oblique thing would do. But in her last weeks, when he had visited her in the care home and she had been clear-eyed and certain the way the dying sometimes become, she had taken his hand and said, "Elliot, you know that old piano at the Caldwells. You remember there's a storage compartment under the bench, and there's a thing I put away under the felt in the top of the case, behind the hammers. Don't let that go without getting it." He had meant to go sooner, The estate sale had been announced before he could arrange it, and by the time he got there, the bench was already gone, sold separately to a couple from Red Deer who had a use for the storage, and the piano was going up in $40 increments with Garrett Fenn making sport of the situation. He had paid $200 to find out what his grandmother had put behind the hammers. The studio he worked in had a freight elevator and a loading dock, and two of his co-tenants, a sound designer named Kwame Osei and a woman who produced ambient electronic music and went by the name Lark, helped him get the piano off the truck and onto the elevator without anyone putting their back out, which Elliot considered a genuine success given the state of the instrument. They set it in the corner of his studio space, and Kwame said, "That is a very sad piano," and Lark said, "I think it's beautiful," and Elliot said nothing, because he was already on his knees with a flashlight, looking at the underside of the lid. The piano was a Lesage upright, and anyone who knew Canadian pianos knew the name, an instrument built in Quebec in the middle of the last century, solid and deliberate, and made to last in houses where winters were long, and music was one of the things that made them shorter. The inside of the case, behind the soundboard and the hammers and the strings, had a narrow shelf of space that the fire had reached only partially. The felt lining had burned away at the edges but held in the middle, and when Elliot reached in with careful hands and peeled back what remained of it, his fingers found a flat tin box, the kind that had once held shortbread cookies, sealed shut with the kind of grip that only happens when something has been in the same position for a very long time. He set it on the floor in front of him and looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it. The first thing was a photograph. His grandmother at maybe 30 years old, standing outside a building he didn't recognize, laughing at something off camera with a laugh he recognized completely because it was the one she still had 60 years later. Beside her in the photograph was a man he had never seen before, tall and well-dressed, and looking at her with an expression that people only have for someone they are certain about. The second thing was a letter, 3 pages in his grandmother's handwriting, addressed to no one and to everyone, which was to say to whoever finally opened this box. The third thing was a document, legal-sized, folded in thirds. He unfolded it with hands that had stopped being steady and read it once fast and once slow, the way you read something you need to make sure you are not misunderstanding. He was not misunderstanding it. Cecile Ashe had come to Alberta in 1971 with a husband who didn't last, and what the family had mostly allowed people to believe was that she had come alone, which was not quite true. She had come with an agreement. The man in the photograph was named Gordon Caldwell, Eleanor's husband, who had died in 1988 and who had been, it turned out, one of the most quietly principled men in Lacombe County. In 1974, after his company had grown into something genuinely valuable, Gordon Caldwell had drawn up a document with a lawyer in Edmonton whose name was on the letterhead. In it, he established a trust. The trust held a share of the original Caldwell Company, now folded into what had become Dunmore Agricultural Holdings, a company Elliot had driven past on the county road and not known the name of. The trust was to be administered on behalf of Cecile Ashe in recognition of her contribution to the family, which this document described in careful language that made it plain. Gordon Caldwell had understood that the kind of help Cecile had given his household was not the kind that could be compensated in wages. The trust was to pass to her children and grandchildren. It had never been claimed because Cecile had never told anyone about it. The lawyer's office had sent letters to an old Nova Scotia address that she no longer held, and after 3 unanswered years, the trust had sat in a legal office in Edmonton, unclaimed, compounding quietly for nearly 30 years. Elliot read his grandmother's letter then. It took him 2 tries because the first time through he was not reading so much as trying to hold on to the shape of what was happening. She had not told anyone, because she had not wanted anyone to feel they had been given something. She had wanted Elliot to find it when he was ready to do something with it, when he was old enough to make it into what it was supposed to be, instead of what fear might make it into. She had not told him the amount, because she said she did not know exactly, and she did not trust herself to say a number without him hearing the number instead of the point. The point, she wrote in her clear, steady hand, is that you were always going to be provided for. I just needed you to find out you could do it yourself first. She had written one more thing at the bottom of the last page. Gordon put it there for me because he was a man who understood that the quiet work is always the work that lasts, and he wanted the people who came after me to know that someone saw it. Someone always saw it. Don't let anyone tell you that a thing done in good faith and without recognition is a thing done for nothing. The piano heard everything. It just needed the right person to open it. Elliot sat on the floor of his studio for a long time. Kwame had gone home. Lark had her headphones on at her desk. The freight elevator hummed somewhere below, and the warehouse made the sounds warehouses make at night, a slow ticking and settling. And the piano sat in the corner of the room with its warped lid and its missing keys. And he looked at it and let everything he was feeling go through him without trying to organize it. He was not sure what to do with a feeling that was grief and joy and something like vindication all braided together. He had spent $200 to drive 2 hours to be laughed at by a man in a diesel truck. And he had come home with a document that would need a lawyer to interpret, and a letter that was still his grandmother's voice, and a photograph of a woman he loved at 30 years old, laughing at something he would never know. The next morning he called the legal office in Edmonton, whose name was on the letterhead. He had to explain the situation twice before the person on the other end understood what he was describing. And then there was a pause on the line that lasted long enough that Elliot thought the call had dropped. It had not dropped. What followed over the next 4 months was not simple. The administration of a 30-year-old trust is not simple, and a law office staffed by people who were not around when it was created is even less so. And Elliot spent a portion of those months learning more about estate law in Alberta than he had ever wanted to know. But the document was real and the trust was real, and the lawyer who finally took the file, a woman named Priya Johal who had the focused energy of someone who found injustice annoying on a personal level, told him on their second meeting that the share had compounded significantly and that significantly was a word she used carefully. She named a number. Elliot asked her to say it again. She did. It was the kind of number that does not change a person's character, but does change the texture of every decision they have to make for the rest of their life. He did not do what he might have done. He did not move to a larger apartment immediately, or trade the old truck in, or do any of the visible things. He sat with it for 3 weeks, which felt to him like what his grandmother would have wanted, and then he made a list of what he thought it was for. The first thing on the list was a recording studio, a real one. Not a shared warehouse space, but a proper studio with a good room and proper acoustic treatment and equipment that did not require workarounds. It was going to be in Edmonton, because Edmonton was where he was from and where he intended to stay, and it was going to be the kind of studio that could record a church choir, or a hip-hop record, or a bluegrass fiddle session, because in his experience those were not as different as people assumed. The second thing on the list was a program for kids. He had grown up in Edmonton, not poor, but adjacent to it, and he knew the specific experience of wanting to make music and not having the equipment to do it, and the specific helplessness of watching that want get smaller every year, until some people stopped having it entirely. He wanted to do something about that, not abstractly but concretely, with sessions and mentors and instruments that children could actually put their hands on. The third thing on the list he almost did not write down. But he wrote it down. He went to the Lacombe auction barn on a Saturday 6 weeks after the documents were settled. He did not call ahead. He pulled in with the same truck because he had not yet replaced it, and he walked in during an active sale, and he waited until Stu Bellamy called a break, and then he asked for 5 minutes. Bellamy was a fair man and a curious one, and he gave him the 5 minutes. Elliot stood up in front of whatever crowd was in the barn that day, about 40 people, and he told them he had been there 6 weeks ago and bought a burned piano for $200 and been laughed at for it. He did not say this with anger. He said it the way his grandmother would have said it, which was as a fact that deserved to be on the record. Then he told them what had been inside it. He did not tell them the amount. He did not need to. What he told them was that a man named Gordon Caldwell had put something in trust for his grandmother in 1974, that his grandmother had put the documentation inside the piano she had played her whole life, and that the piano had sat in an estate sale and been dismissed as firewood until a young man from Edmonton, who nobody expected to be interested in it, paid $200 and drove 2 hours because someone he loved had asked him to remember it. He told them because his grandmother had believed in letting people reckon with true things. The barn was quiet in the way it had not been quiet on the day he had bought the piano. He looked at Garrett Fenn, who was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed, and a face that had gone still in the way that faces go still when a story has landed somewhere uncomfortable. Elliot held his gaze for a moment, not with cruelty and not without purpose, and then he looked back at Bellamy and thanked him for the time. He drove back to Edmonton. Garrett Fenn said nothing that day and drove home in his diesel truck and told the story to his wife in the kitchen that night. And she said what any person with sense says when they hear that story, which was, "Lord, Garrett." And that was the beginning and the end of the sympathy he received on the matter, which was perhaps as much as he was owed. The studio opened 14 months later. Elliot named it after his grandmother, which was not a surprise to anyone who had known them both. Cecile's, with the accent on the first syllable the way she had always insisted on. He put a photograph of her in the lobby, the one from the tin box, the one where she was 30 years old and laughing at something just off camera, and people who came to record there asked about it. And he told them, and most of them understood immediately what they were looking at, which was a woman who had done the quiet work and trusted someone else to carry it forward. The piano was there too. He had not repaired it and had not tried to. The missing keys were still missing, and the lid still sat crooked on its hinges, and the veneer was still lifted away from the case in the pattern the fire had left it in. It stood in the corner of the lobby where the afternoon light came in, and it was the first thing you saw when you walked through the door. Some things are worth more open than restored. The piano had held a secret for 30 years. Now it stood in a room full of music and held nothing back, and that seemed to Elliot like the right ending for a thing that had been waiting a very long time to be found. There is a question at the end of a story like this one that is worth sitting with. Not about Garrett Fenn, who is simply a mirror in this story, a reflection of every voice that has ever assigned a value to a person or a thing before looking twice. The question is about the piano, about all the burned and warped and missing key things that get rolled out on a hand truck and priced for scrap because no one in the room has the particular reason to look closer. Cecile Ashe played piano in a church for 26 years and kept a promise for 30 and trusted her grandson to be the person who would know what to do. She did not get to see him do it. That is the part of quiet faithfulness that costs the most, and it is also the part that tends to last. If someone you love left you something that asked more of you than you expected, and you chose to go after it even when the room was laughing, stay a while. There are more of those stories here, and every one of them belongs to someone who listened before they played.